I always believed anniversaries were meant to celebrate love, not destroy it. That night, as I dressed in my favorite deep blue gown, I felt the weight of 20 years of marriage wrapped around me like a fragile silk thread, strong yet easily breakable if pulled too hard. My husband, Daniel, had insisted on making reservations at one of the city's most luxurious restaurants. "You deserve the best," he'd said, kissing my forehead. His voice carried the warmth I had fallen in love with 2 decades ago, but his eyes, something about them felt distant, as if he were already elsewhere. Still, I ignored the nagging unease in my chest. Tonight, I told myself, would be about us, about everything we had built together. A beautiful home, 2 children studying abroad, and what I thought was unshakable trust. When we arrived at the restaurant, the setting was perfect. Candles flickered on each table, their flames reflecting off crystal glasses. Soft piano music floated through the air. It was exactly the kind of night I had imagined until she arrived. A woman, barely in her late 20s, walked toward our table in a slim red dress that clung to her like a second skin. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look lost. She walked with purpose, straight to our table. "Darling, you made it," Daniel said, standing to greet her with a smile that shattered the air inside my lungs. "Darling?" My heart skipped, then pounded as he pulled out a chair for her. She sat down like she belonged there. My confusion turned to ice, spreading through my veins, but before I could ask who she was, Daniel introduced her. "This is Claire," he said casually, as if her presence on our anniversary was the most natural thing in the world. "My business partner." Business partner. My lips curved into a polite smile, but my hands trembled under the table. Something wasn't right. No business partner attended a couple's anniversary dinner. Claire leaned forward, her manicured fingers brushing Daniel's arm as she spoke. "I'm so glad to finally meet you," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness, but her eyes glimmered with something else. Victory. Dinner passed in awkward silence, with Daniel carrying most of the conversation. I barely tasted the food. My chest ached with suspicion, but I bit my tongue. I wasn't going to embarrass myself by making wild accusations. Not yet. And then, just as dessert was being served, Claire placed her hand gently over her stomach. The gesture was subtle, almost tender. She looked at me, then at Daniel, and smiled. "I wasn't sure if I should say this tonight," she began softly, "but I'm pregnant." The world around me froze. The music, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it turned into a distant hum. Pregnant? I turned to Daniel, praying he would laugh, dismiss it, call it a joke. But he didn't. Instead, he raised his glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said proudly, as if he had just received the greatest blessing. His eyes sparkled, not with guilt, not with regret, but with joy. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled. A calm, icy smile that concealed the storm brewing within me. Because right then I knew 2 things. Daniel had betrayed me in the cruelest way possible, and I was going to take everything from him. The drive home that night was silent, but inside my mind, storms raged louder than thunder. Daniel hummed softly to himself, his hand tapping the steering wheel in rhythm, as if nothing monumental had happened. as if his mistress announcing a pregnancy at our anniversary dinner was a normal, casual thing. I stared out the window, my reflection ghostly against the glass. My lips still carried that practiced smile, but behind it, every nerve in my body pulsed with betrayal. "Don't be upset," Daniel finally broke the silence, his tone almost patronizing. "You're overreacting. Claire is important to me. To us. She'll be part of our lives now." "Part of our lives?" I repeated, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. "You mean the child too?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I'll take care of her and the baby. But nothing changes between us, darling. You still have your place as my wife. My queen. My queen." The words were poison. He thought I would accept this, swallow his betrayal, and continue living in the gilded cage he built for me. A house, wealth, status, none of it mattered if respect was gone. I turned my face back to the window, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of my anger. If Daniel thought I was going to fight, scream, or beg, he was wrong. I wasn't going to break. I was going to plan. That night, while Daniel slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed every detail, the way he smiled at her, the toast, the pride in his voice. It wasn't just an affair. It was a betrayal so deep it carved me open. I rose quietly, went to my study, and unlocked the drawer where I kept all our financial documents. Years ago, Daniel had insisted I didn't need to bother myself with boring money matters. But I wasn't foolish. I had copies of everything: bank accounts, property titles, investments. I poured myself a glass of wine and began reviewing the files. For years, I had been the silent partner in our life. Now I would be the strategist. By 3 a.m., I knew exactly where every dollar, every share, every hidden asset was. Daniel thought he was clever, but nothing escapes a wife who has been watching in silence. I whispered to myself, "If you think you can humiliate me, you've forgotten who I am." The next morning, Daniel acted as though the world hadn't shifted. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work, as if his betrayal could be erased with routine. But I played along. I made his coffee, smiled when he complimented my cooking, waved him goodbye. I gave him the performance he expected, the obedient, devoted wife. As soon as he left, I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Mark, my old friend and attorney. He had once said, "If you ever need me, just call. No matter what." "Mark," I said, my voice steady but cold, "I need to discuss divorce proceedings." Quietly. "And I need everything, the house, the assets, the accounts. Everything." There was a pause on the line, then his calm reply, "Tell me everything. We'll make sure he's left with nothing but his guilt." I hung up, my hand trembling, but not from fear. From power. Daniel thought he had broken me, but he had only awakened the part of me he had long underestimated. This wasn't the end of my story. This was the beginning of his downfall. The days that followed were a blur of polite smiles and secret meetings. To Daniel, I was the same devoted wife, cooking his meals, asking about his day, pretending to fuss over the smallest details of our home. He had no idea that while he laughed with Claire on the phone, I was mapping out his destruction. Mark, my attorney, met me in a quiet cafe far from the city. His eyes scanned me carefully, as if measuring the steel beneath my calm exterior. "Tell me everything," he said, notebook open, pen ready. I laid it all out, the affair, the pregnancy announcement, the finances I had uncovered in our locked drawer. Every hidden account, every investment property, every offshore transfer Daniel thought was invisible. Mark raised his eyebrows. "You've done half my job for me. You realize with the proof you have, we can drain him dry." I sipped my coffee, my hands steady. That's the point. He doesn't just get to humiliate me. He pays for it. That evening, when Daniel came home, he spoke of Claire as though she were some noble cause. "She's been stressed," he sighed, loosening his tie. "Pregnancy isn't easy, you know. I'm trying to make her comfortable. You understand, right?" I looked at him, my face serene. "Of course. I understand." If he noticed the cold edge in my voice, he ignored it. His arrogance had blinded him to danger. The weeks turned into months, and Daniel's double life became almost comical. Dinners with me, then late-night business meetings that stretched until dawn. He still believed he had full control over me, that I would never leave because I loved the comfort of his wealth. He didn't know that every time he left, I was gathering more evidence. Photos of him with Claire. Bank statements showing his lavish spending on her. Even recordings of his careless words, bragging about how he had the best of both worlds. The mask I wore was heavy, but I carried it with precision. The more he believed I was quiet and obedient, the sharper my knife became. One evening, Claire called the house. Daniel wasn't home yet. I answered. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Claire," I said, my tone sweet as honey. There was silence on the line. Then a nervous laugh. "Oh, I didn't realize you'd answer. I suppose you thought I was just the forgotten wife," I replied, still calm. "But don't worry. I know everything." She stuttered. I didn't mean to." "Oh, I know you didn't mean to," I interrupted. "But let me tell you something, Claire. Enjoy the money while it lasts, because soon it won't be his to give." I hung up before she could respond. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the thrill of finally pulling back the curtain. That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I stared at him, the man I had once loved, the man who had vowed to cherish me. His face was peaceful, unknowing. I whispered into the darkness, "You took my love for granted. Now I'll take everything you ever cared about." The following morning, Mark called with updates. "Divorce papers are ready. We'll serve him when you say the word. But I suggest waiting. Let him dig his hole deeper. The court loves a fool who exposes himself." A slow smile spread across my face. "Then we wait," I said. "Let him believe he's winning. The fall will be harder that way." And so I continued my act, the loyal wife, the silent supporter. But beneath that mask, every day brought me closer to the moment Daniel's world would shatter. By the time autumn arrived, the air was cooler, the leaves were gold, and my patience was razor sharp. Daniel still strutted around the house as if nothing was wrong, as if I didn't notice the faint perfume on his suits or the lipstick stains too bold to be mine. He believed I was blind. But in truth, I was watching closer than ever. It was at a charity gala, one Daniel insisted I attend, where the cracks in his perfect performance began to show. We walked in arm, smiling for photographs, the epitome of a successful couple. But across the room I caught sight of her, Claire, radiant in a red gown, her pregnancy now impossible to hide. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before recovering, waving politely to acquaintances as though he hadn't just seen his mistress standing a few feet away from his wife. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, keeping my smile painted firmly on. But Claire wasn't subtle. She walked right up to us, her hand resting on her stomach as if the world needed reminding of what she carried. "Daniel," she said sweetly, eyes darting toward me, "you didn't tell me your wife was coming." The air between us froze. My chest tightened, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I extended my hand. "Of course I'm here," I replied evenly. "After all, Daniel and I go everywhere together." "Don't we, darling?" Daniel stammered, sweat beading at his temples, but nodded. "Why, yes, of course." Inside, I laughed. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The rest of the evening was a performance. Daniel tried to juggle us both, avoiding questions, keeping conversations shallow. But the whispers had already started. People noticed. The way Claire lingered too close. The way Daniel flinched when our eyes met. By the time we returned home, his nerves were frayed. He poured himself a drink, pacing the living room. "She shouldn't have been there," he muttered. "She knows better." "Really?" I asked, taking off my earrings, my tone light. She seemed rather comfortable. He shot me a sharp glance. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said with a small shrug. "Only that she looked like she belonged." The glass nearly cracked in his grip. "You're imagining things." But we both knew the truth. It wasn't my imagination. It was his reality unraveling. The next morning, I received a message from an unknown number. "You deserve better than him. Call me." I frowned, staring at the screen. The number wasn't saved, but something told me it was Claire. Perhaps she thought she could taunt me, or perhaps she underestimated the strength of the woman she was trying to replace. I didn't call. I didn't need to. She had already given me another piece of the puzzle, evidence that she was not just complicit but proud of her betrayal. At my next meeting with Mark, I handed over the message along with fresh photos of Daniel sneaking into Claire's apartment. Mark shook his head. "He's digging his own grave. With this, we'll own everything. Property, accounts, assets, the court will side with you." "Good," I said softly. "But I don't just want the assets. I want the humiliation. I want him to stand in front of everyone he fooled and realize he's lost everything." Mark studied me carefully. "You're not the same woman who walked into my office months ago." "No," I agreed, my voice firm. "That woman loved him. This one doesn't." That night, as Daniel slept beside me, I opened my journal. On the first page, in bold letters, I wrote, "Patience is power. Revenge is art." And I knew his downfall wasn't just coming. It would be unforgettable. By the time winter approached, I had mastered the art of silence. Silence is not weakness, it is strategy. And Daniel, in his arrogance, mistook my quiet composure for defeat. He strutted through life as though nothing could touch him, laughing a little louder, staying out a little later, returning home smelling of her perfume. But while he was busy weaving lies, I was busy weaving a net. Started subtly. I called our accountant and requested copies of every financial statement, every joint investment, every hidden account Daniel thought I didn't know about. I discovered that he had been quietly moving money, large sums, into a private account. Probably for her. Probably for their future child. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I made my own quiet moves. I opened a private account under my name, separate from his reach. Every time I withdrew household cash, I tucked a portion away. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. Then came the lawyer meetings. Mark guided me like a chess master, positioning each piece where it needed to be. "We wait until he's overconfident," he said. "That's when he'll slip." And slip Daniel did. It was on a snowy Thursday evening when he arrived home flushed and smug. He tossed his coat carelessly over a chair, humming under his breath. "What's put you in such a good mood?" I asked lightly, stirring soup in the kitchen. "Business deal," he lied smoothly. "Big one. It's all coming together." I watched him take a sip of wine, his hands relaxed, his guard down. He didn't know that only hours before I had received an anonymous tip. Claire had moved into a townhouse he had secretly purchased under his name. The deed had his signature, bold and undeniable. "Oh, really?" I said, feigning admiration. "I hope it's worth all the time you've been putting in." He grinned, not catching the steel in my tone. "Trust me, sweetheart, it is." That night I stood by the window, watching the snow fall, and made my decision. It was no longer about survival. It was about reclamation. He had taken years of my life, my trust, my loyalty. Now I would take everything back. I began with subtle traps. One afternoon, I accidentally left an envelope on the counter, filled with papers from Mark detailing marital property laws. Daniel found it, of course, and his face went pale as he skimmed it. "What's this?" he demanded. I looked up from my tea. "Just reading. You never know when knowledge might come in handy." Paranoia that followed was exquisite. He began checking my phone, questioning where I went, who I saw. The irony was delicious, the cheater suddenly suspicious. The breaking point came at a holiday party hosted by one of Daniel's business partners. Claire was there, glowing, her belly prominent, her hand resting proudly on Daniel's arm. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were open conversations behind clinking glasses. I stood at the edge of the room, smiling politely, my heart pounding with an odd mixture of rage and satisfaction. Everyone could see it now. Everyone knew. And then the toast. Daniel raised his glass, his voice booming. "To new beginnings," he declared. "To the future." Crowd cheered, glasses lifted, while Claire leaned into him possessively. And I smiled, because I knew their future was about to collapse. When we returned home, Daniel tried to act normal, but his drunken swagger betrayed him. He kissed my cheek absent-mindedly before retreating upstairs. I stayed downstairs, pulling a thick folder from my bag. Inside were bank statements, property deeds, photographs, and the message Claire had sent me. Evidence. Proof. Ammunition. I spread the papers across the table, my hands steady. This was no longer a plan. It was an execution. As midnight passed, I whispered into the silence of the house. "You've taken enough from me, Daniel. Tomorrow I take everything back." The next morning, Daniel walked into the kitchen like a king returning to his throne. His hair was still damp from the shower, his silk tie perfectly knotted. He whistled as he poured himself coffee, and I couldn't help but marvel at how smug he looked, so sure, so untouchable. He had no idea that his empire was built on sand, and the tide was already coming in. "Morning, darling," he said, kissing the top of my head. "Big meeting today." I smiled sweetly. "Good luck. I'm sure you'll impress everyone." He grinned, not catching the venom tucked beneath my words. Because today I wasn't just the quiet wife making breakfast. Today I was the executioner sharpening her blade. After he left, I gathered the documents spread across my desk and made one last call to Mark, my lawyer. He listened carefully, then said the words I had been waiting to hear. "We're ready. Do you want to move forward?" "Yes," I replied firmly. "It's time." Mark outlined the steps. First, we would freeze the joint accounts to prevent Daniel from moving any more funds. Next, we'd file the divorce papers, accompanied by evidence of infidelity and financial betrayal. And finally, we'd prepare the motion to seize his assets, especially the townhouse he bought for Claire. "Timing is everything," Mark warned. "Once this begins, it will hit him like a storm." I leaned back in my chair, imagining Daniel's face when he realized everything was slipping through his fingers. For years, I had been the supporting character in his story. Now I was taking the pen and rewriting the ending. Later that evening, Daniel returned home brimming with false confidence. "Deal closed," he announced, pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch. "We're going to be set for life." "We already are," I replied smoothly, hiding my smirk. He chuckled, not realizing I meant something entirely different. He sat across from me, legs stretched out, glass in hand, looking like a man who thought he had one. "Maybe we should celebrate," he said, raising his glass. "Oh, we will," I murmured. "Soon." That night, as he drifted into a satisfied sleep, I quietly slipped out of bed and into the study. I laid out the final folder of evidence and read through it one last time. Photos of him and Claire, receipts from secret dinners, property records, transfers to hidden accounts, every betrayal cataloged and waiting. I wasn't rushing. No, I was savoring this. Because revenge wasn't just about the end, it was about the slow, deliberate unraveling of everything he thought he controlled. The next morning, while Daniel was in his meeting, Mark filed the papers. Freezing the accounts was the first domino to fall. The bank confirmed it within the hour. Daniel's business expenses suddenly couldn't be paid, and his phone began buzzing furiously. By noon, the divorce filing hit his office. His assistant reportedly walked in with the envelope, and within minutes, Daniel stormed out of the meeting, his face red, his voice raised. Meanwhile, I was at home, sipping tea by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily outside. Peaceful. Serene. Because chaos was no longer mine to carry, it was his. When he finally returned home, he burst through the door, waving the papers in his hand. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fury. "Exactly what it looks like," I said calmly. "You wanted a new beginning, Daniel? Here it is." "You can't do this to me," he shouted. I tilted my head, studying him like a stranger. "Oh, but I can. And I already have." That night, the house echoed with his rage, doors slamming, curses flying, but none of it touched me. I sat silently, almost serenely, because for the first time in years, I wasn't the victim. I was in control. And as Daniel finally collapsed into silence upstairs, I whispered into the stillness of the house. "You thought you broke me, Daniel. But all you did was set me free." The next morning, Daniel was already gone by the time I came downstairs. Normally, his absence would have meant another long day of pretending everything was fine, but now, his desperation was working in my favor. The silence in the house felt different. It wasn't lonely anymore, it was liberating. He wasn't in control, not anymore. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was Mark, my lawyer. "He's scrambling," Mark said with a chuckle. "Tried to unfreeze the accounts this morning. The bank refused. He's already called twice." I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. "Good. Let him sweat. He needs to know what it feels like to be powerless. You're enjoying this, aren't you? After what he's done." I'd be lying if I said no. By afternoon, Daniel stormed into the house. His suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie askew, his face pale with fury. He slammed the door behind him, his voice booming through the walls. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snarled, waving his phone in the air. "Freezing the accounts? Filing those papers? You can't win, not against me." I folded my arms, my tone icy. "Daniel, for years you had the power. You made me feel small, disposable, like I was just an accessory to your perfect little life. But here's the truth, you underestimated me. You thought I'd just cry and accept it. Not this time." He laughed bitterly. "You won't survive without me. You don't have the guts." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "Watch me." That night I barely slept. Not because of fear, but because of anticipation. I knew Daniel would try to fight back, but every attempt only dug him deeper into the hole he had created. It was almost poetic. His arrogance had become his downfall. The following morning, I received another call from Mark. "Daniel tried to move some assets offshore," he said. "Too late. Court order already blocked them. He's furious." I could almost picture Daniel's face when he realized every avenue was cut off. He gave me a strange kind of satisfaction, not cruel but justified. He had destroyed years of trust with one careless decision, and now the consequences were finally catching up to him. That evening, Daniel tried a different tactic. He came home calmer, his tone softer, his smile rehearsed. "Listen, we don't have to do this," he said gently, sitting across from me at the table. We've had our problems, sure, but we can work it out. Why throw away everything we've built? I stared at him, searching his face for even a shred of sincerity. But all I saw was calculation. He wasn't trying to save us. He was trying to save himself. You should have thought of that before you toasted another woman at our anniversary dinner, I said coldly. His jaw clenched, the mask slipping for just a moment. Then he leaned back, smirking. You'll regret this. You think you can handle life without me? You'll crumble. But as he spoke, I realized something. Daniel was terrified. Beneath the arrogance and the threats, he was unraveling. And I was the one pulling the threads. That night, I stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. I didn't feel like a background character in his story. No, this was my story now. I whispered to myself, almost like a vow. He can fight all he wants, but this time I'm the one writing the ending. The morning after that disastrous anniversary dinner, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the remnants of a life I once thought was unbreakable. The ring on my finger suddenly felt like a shackle. His laughter from the night before echoed in my mind, paired with her smug announcement. Pregnant. The words stabbed me again and again. And worse, he had raised his glass to celebrate it while I sat there invisible. I didn't cry anymore. Tears had dried. In their place grew something colder, sharper, clarity. 4 years I had supported his dreams, his late nights, his excuses. I had believed in his stories about business trips and urgent meetings. But last night stripped away every illusion. He wasn't just cheating. He had built an entire parallel life and was arrogant enough to parade it before me. I knew one thing: I couldn't play the role of the quiet, submissive wife anymore. If he thought I would sit back while he built a future with her using the years of sacrifice I had poured into our marriage, he was sorely mistaken. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened my laptop. First step was information. I dug into his emails, his shared accounts, and the files we once managed together. It didn't take long to uncover what I suspected. She wasn't just his business partner. She was listed as a co-director in one of his side companies, one I hadn't even known existed. And worse, my money had funded its startup. The down payment for that office space, the initial investment, even the equipment, every penny traced back to our joint account. Rage simmered, but I stayed calm. Emotion would only cloud judgment. Instead, I took screenshots, saved emails, and gathered documents. Every betrayal became a piece of evidence. By the time I closed the laptop, I had a thick digital folder titled simply, "The Truth." That night, he came home as if nothing had happened. He loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and asked, "Rough night, huh?" as though we'd just had an awkward dinner with colleagues. The audacity almost made me laugh. "Do you think I'm stupid?" I asked, my voice steady. He looked up, pretending not to understand. "What do you mean?" "Don't play games," I said. "I know about the company. I know about the money. And I know she's more than your business partner." His glass froze midair, but only for a second. Then he smirked, the same arrogant smirk I'd seen last night. "Finally," he said. "You've figured it out. No denial, No apology. Just smug satisfaction. My stomach twisted, but I held my ground. You've taken my loyalty for granted for too long. You think you've won, but you've underestimated me. His eyebrows rose, amused. And what are you going to do? Walk away? You wouldn't last a month without me. I smiled, and this time it wasn't forced. That's what you think. But you'll soon find out that everything you've built, every company, every deal, you built with my support, my sacrifices, and my money. And I'll make sure you lose it all. For the first time, the smirk faltered. His grip on the glass tightened, his knuckles white. You wouldn't dare. I leaned closer, my voice a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Watch me. That night, as he stormed off to the bedroom, I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the folder on my laptop. The truth wasn't just proof of betrayal. It was my weapon. And I was done being the victim. The game had begun, and this time I wasn't playing to survive. I was playing to win. The morning the world tilted on its axis felt ordinary at first. Gray light through the blinds, the kettle whistling, the routine of a house that had seen better mornings. But I had spent months turning ordinary into opportunity. I had stacked evidence, threaded witnesses into place, and waited for the exact breath where everything could be revealed at once. Today was that breath. Mark arrived early, his briefcase heavy, his expression all business. "Are you ready?" he asked, not unkindly. I nodded. I felt the old electric thrill, not of malice but of justice answering a long call. "Do it," I whispered. He called his contact at the paper, a journalist who'd once done a few pieces on corporate fraud, and handed over the folder titled The Truth. There were bank transfers with my name faintly beside the entries, emails where Daniel signed off on bonuses to a shell company, invoices for Claire's consulting that matched up with equipment rented to her townhouse. There were photographs of late-night meetings, screens with messages that read like confessions, and spreadsheets showing the siphoning of funds. Each page was a careful, cold stitch in a fabric meant to be torn open. By noon, the headline was live. Local CEO accused of embezzling family funds to finance secret affair. The first shock ricocheted through Daniel's office like a broken window. Phones rang off their hooks. Partners called emergency meetings. Investors texted in short, sharp sentences filled with panic. I watched the newsfeed on my phone while making tea, hands steady as though watching a slow-moving play. The anchor read the bullet points with the clinical tone of theater, while behind her, images of documents scrolled. I could see my son through those images, smaller now, not the man I'd married but a figure made fragile by his own choices. The firm's board convened within the hour. I received a text from an unknown number. Is this really true? It was from one of their longest-standing investors. The reply I sent was simple, yes. Check the filings. I have copies. The reply back came quickly, we'll be there. When Daniel's phone started ringing, he tried to steam his way through it. His voice, the one I knew so well, snapped and frayed as he lied to colleagues and pleaded for time. "It's under control," he mouthed to the empty living room, but there was no conviction left in the words. Claire's name trended within hours. Her Instagram, once full of staged smiles and filtered sunsets, filled with messages, sotto voce accusations, and the inevitable sleaze of comment sections. She posted a statement about being shocked and completely unaware of any wrongdoing. Read thin and brittle. People saw through the varnish. Then the coup de grace, a call from the bank. "We received notice from corporate counsel," the manager said, voice careful and distant. "We've frozen the accounts pending investigation." The sound of that sentence struck like a bell. Daniel's empire, at least the parts that had been dressed in my money, was suddenly immobile. I felt no glee at his panic. I felt a fierce private satisfaction. This was not about watching him fall so much as making sure he could no longer stand on the bones of my life. The reporters kept calling, and Mark kept answering with the composed cadence of someone who knows the legal ground beneath him is solid. By late afternoon, representatives from the company had come to the house. They were polite, clinical. "We need to speak to you formally," one man said, clipboard in hand. "We're opening a full audit." I led them to the study and poured them the tea I'd been brewing all morning. I presented documents like a librarian offering overdue books. Every transfer, every ledger entry, every evening's dinner tab that matched a transfer to Claire's account. The room hummed with a tension I'd once imagined as thunder. Then, as if choreographed, the board called an emergency press conference. The statement read, "Pending investigation, Daniel Ellis has been placed on administrative leave." That phrase felt like a verdict. The office lights dimmed for him that afternoon in ways they never had for me after 20 years of late nights and unpaid sacrifices. Sunset, the smell of rain came through the window, cool and honest. My son came home in the dark, eyes hollow. He didn't march in with fury this time. He slumped into a chair like a man whose map had been burned. "Why would you do this?" he asked, voice small and ragged. "Why did you do it?" I answered. It was a question that settled on him like dust. He opened his mouth, closed it. Regret tasted like metal in the air. He had been arrogant enough to think the show would never end. He had been wrong. I didn't celebrate. I sat with the quiet, the gravity of what we both now had to live with. The headlines were not prizes, they were consequences. But finally, at long last, the truth had been put in a place where it could be reckoned with. In courts, among partners, with law and evidence and the steady machinery of institutions that had once been used to hide the theft. Outside, the rain began to fall. Swept the dust from the street, and in that small ritual I felt something like cleansing. Didn't erase the past. It offered a new space to stand in, no longer bending to someone else's deception. Tomorrow would be harder. Trials, hearings, explanations. But that night I allowed myself a single breath of relief. The exposure had begun. The man who toasted betrayal in a dining room full of witnesses now had to face the witnesses of his own deeds. The end was not yet written. But the pen was no longer in his hands. The air in the courtroom was thick with whispers, the kind that cling to walls long after voices have faded. I sat in the second row, my spine straight, hands folded, every nerve alert but steady. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The reckoning, the day Daniel would face the full weight of what he had so carelessly sown. Claire was there too, seated on the opposite side, her once polished appearance dulled by sleepless nights and public scrutiny. She wore a gray suit that did little to hide the swelling of her pregnancy. I wondered briefly if the child would ever know the kind of man their father really was. Daniel walked in escorted by his attorney, his once commanding presence deflated. The sharp lines of confidence that used to mark his face had collapsed into something gaunt, hollow. He looked older, smaller, as though betrayal itself had aged him overnight. Charges were read aloud, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of his reputation. Embezzlement, misappropriation of funds, breach of fiduciary duty. The words echoed, heavy and final. He barely blinked, though his jaw tightened when the evidence, my evidence, was entered into the record. 4 hours, witnesses testified. Mark spoke first, calm and methodical, laying out timelines and transfers with a precision that stripped the story of any deniability. Then came the auditors, confirming the siphoned accounts, the falsified invoices. Every number became another crack in the facade Daniel had spent years polishing. When it was my turn, the room hushed. I walked to the stand with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. The lawyer asked simple questions, and I answered with truth, not embellished, not sharpened by bitterness, simply truth. I told them about the anniversary dinner, the toast that shattered my world, the trail of lies uncovered like rotting roots beneath a once proud tree. "Why did you choose to come forward?" the lawyer asked. I looked at Daniel then, his eyes darting anywhere but mine. Because silence would have made me complicit. Because I built this life too, and I refused to let it be dismantled in shadows. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Not pity, not applause, just acknowledgement. They understood. The defense tried to spin a narrative of misunderstanding, of overzealous bookkeeping, of mistakes made in the chaos of corporate growth. But each excuse fell flat against the mountain of evidence. Even Claire's teary testimony, rehearsed and fragile, couldn't soften the blow. By the time the judge adjourned for deliberation, the outcome was already clear. The verdict came swiftly, guilty. Daniel was sentenced to prison, his empire dismantled, his name etched into headlines not as a titan but as a cautionary tale. The gavel struck like thunder, final and unyielding. I left the courthouse without celebration. Victory wasn't sweet, it was solemn. Justice had been served, but justice doesn't stitch wounds. Doesn't erase the anniversaries wasted, the love I once thought unshakable. What it does is draw a line, a boundary where suffering ends and accountability begins. Sighed, the sun was sharp and brilliant, almost cruel in its brightness. I stood for a long moment, breathing in air that finally felt untainted. Mark appeared beside me, his presence steady, no words needed. We walked away together, not as victors, not as avengers, but as survivors stepping into a life no longer dictated by deceit. Later that night, alone in my home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to my story, yet somehow comforting. I thought of all I had lost, but also of what I had reclaimed, my dignity, my voice, my freedom. The lesson was carved deep. Love without respect is a cage, and silence in the face of betrayal is surrender. I had done neither. I had risen. And as I took that first quiet sip, I whispered to myself, not bitter, not triumphant, but resolute, never again.